Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a guest who's been on the podcast several times at this point, and this is Steve Hall. So I don't believe he needs an introduction. But Steve, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast once again.
I always appreciate being invited on podcasts and particularly back on because I know running my own podcast, there's a reason you bring guests back on. Hopefully it isn't just because there's someone you can bring on easy, because I can imagine people doing that. But normally it's because it's like, hey, you have fun chatting to them and they provide really good information and people seem to enjoy those episodes. So it's nice. I appreciate being invited on. So thank you, Nikias.
Oh, you're very welcome. Obviously, the reason is that you're easy and you always say yes. No, I'm joking. It's because people do get a lot of value out of your episodes. Nah, of course, it's because I get a lot of value out of talking to you and the audience does as well. And today we have an interesting episode because I want to talk a little bit about drama in the fitness industry, and I want to talk a little bit about your evolution, the evolution of your thoughts around bulking. And I'm going to start with the drama because that's what people like. But, knowing you and me, we're not going to name names really because it's not necessary. We're just going to challenge ideas today. And the drama I'm referring to, which, dear listeners, you may or may not be familiar with, is the fact that lately there has been this message going around that bulking is supposedly bad. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm doing air quotes right now. Or if you're listening, well, if you're watching, you know. But if you're listening, I'm doing air quotes right now. And so, Steve, I brought you on because I wonder about your thoughts around this idea that bulking is that. And just to characterize it a little bit more for the audience, what the people sharing this idea are saying, based on my understanding of their content, is that you do not need to bulk in order to maximize muscle growth. And in fact, some of these people go so far as to suggest that bulking is inadvisable because you're only going to gain excess fat. So, Steve, based on this interpretation of the, let's say, tagline, bulking is dead, what are your thoughts on this?
My immediate thoughts are utter frustration, because to say like bulking is dead, bulking is inadvisable, it's such an extreme stance that lacks total nuance. And like anything, it depends. It really does. For some individuals, maybe bulking is dead to them. Like it's just not the route for them to go to. And there could be legit situations where it's not the right choice. But for a lot of people, especially those with a lot of growth potential, which I'm sure we'll talk about, bulking is absolutely the route to getting bigger and more muscular. I know if I never went through any bulk periods, I would not be where I am today. And I certainly have gone too far with bulking as well, which, hey, a lot of people have done that, right? You kind of do well, hopefully not too many, but I did a bit of a dreamer bulk. I call it like a folk fat bulk. I certainly was there, and you can't kind of force feed muscle growth by any means. But yeah, to say you can maximize muscle growth without a calorie deficit, it's then a question of, my immediate thought is like, where are you getting that from? Like, what's your resource? And interestingly enough, the paper that they tend to throw out is Eric Helm's recent paper on massing. Because actually, when we think about bulking, I was just looking through my notes here because I've obviously done research on this. I've spoken to many individuals about kind of nutrition for muscle growth. And we have like Garth 2013, Ribeiro 2019, and then Helms 2023. And I'm not sure if we have much more than that. There was, Rosniak 2002, and then Smith 2021. Anyway, there's not that many papers. A lot of them are like review papers, or they're kind of looking over like theoretical things versus actually studying it. And Eric's is definitely the best paper that we have to date. And it's funny that they use that as their argument for why bulking is dead. I can understand it to some extent because the biggest kind of thing that you got with being in a surplus, and a larger surplus in particular, was exponential fat gain. And in that study, a lot of individuals gained very similar amounts of muscle, whether they are at maintenance or in a surplus. We have to recognize like there's so many limitations, and it's one study. But also the really funny thing to me is, as someone who's like, I don't know, like also evidence-based, I often was using that as my reference for why I think a surplus is a good idea. Because fundamentally, the author's conclusions in the end was recommending to be in a surplus for muscle growth. So I'm like, why would you reference a paper that recommends a surplus for muscle growth as bulking being dead and a surplus is inadvisable? It kind of just, then you're talking roundabouts with people where they've already made their mind up. And you'll find this, Nick, yes, if you ever have people commenting your stuff and they have a really quite extreme stance on something, you try and be reasonable with them, you talk to them, there's no debating them. They've made their mind up. No matter what you say, they'll throw it back at you. And then it goes really into weird directions where even people will further their kind of comments on this and be like, oh, actually, gaining weight doesn't guarantee you're in a surplus because you could be gaining lean tissue and that's your new maintenance. And I'm just like, what mental math are you trying to make here to say that when your weight goes up, you're not in a surplus? Like, that's just basic to me, where it's like, hey, for weight to go up, surplus. Over the long term, obviously, there's water fluctuations and all of this. But if your body weight is going up over the long term, you've gained 10, 20 pounds. When I first started lifting, sorry about the dog, I was like 130 pounds or what have you. And I massed all the way up. And now I'm sitting at 185 and just as lean as then. It's like, were you saying I just maintained all my way there? Like that just, how do I build more bricks? Like I need more bricks to build more of this house. So I honestly think it's a discussion that's got very lost in nuance and it's become like a flashy thing to just say. And then some people will try and argue and they'll be like, oh, but you can grow muscle in a deficit, grow muscle at maintenance. It's like, hey, I'm not arguing against that. We have literally research showing that we can do that. But that's a different question to maximizing muscle growth over the long term of a lifter's career. To say that you never need to go into a surplus, I think is fundamentally false and would harm a lot of people's long-term progress. So a bit of a ramble of my thoughts on this.
No, I asked, so no problem at all.
Yeah.
I think that ultimately what you said at the beginning is the crux of the issue, the fact that it's not nuanced at all. The message is stop bulking, it's wrong. When bulking is a tool, going into a surplus for the purpose of gaining weight is a tool. And if it's not aligned with your goals, sure, don't use it. But that doesn't mean that it's not aligned with anybody's goals.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I was
Go
just going to
ahead.
say, like, if you are starting out in the gym, then your growth potential is huge. If you are very skinny and ectomorphic, if we use that non-scientific term, actually, I don't know why I used it. Let's say like you're what people look as if they're an ectomorph or a hard gainer, like they're just they've always been skinny, they really struggled to put on weight. Like then a surplus is a really useful tool for you. But if you're someone who's overweight, you've got a lot of body fat on you, going to a surplus is not the answer. You want to diet, and if you have the growth potential of a novice, then you're likely to gain muscle and the body can utilize the fat like on its body. That's its surplus of energy essentially. So it's like you say, it's a tool for the right person in the right context. But yeah, I think to just say black and white, no one should ever bulk is incorrect.
Well, I think we didn't have very much drama because we largely agree, but we addressed the drama that exists right now in the fitness industry. And I think what you said last regarding whether somebody would benefit from a surplus or not is a good segue into starting to talk about how your thoughts on bulking have evolved since the last time we talked about this, which was when you first appeared on the podcast. It was we recorded together an interview where I asked you all about your approach to massing phases or bulking phases. So for this podcast, what I did was, for this particular interview today, I actually went back and listened to that episode anew, and I wrote down some aspects of nutrition and training. I wrote down what you said at the time, and based on what you have been talking about lately, because I regularly follow your content, I thought that these particular considerations you might have some thoughts around in terms of perhaps you've changed your mind now. So I thought I would bring those up first. And then if there is anything that we haven't touched on that you've changed your mind on and you can think of, we can touch on those. And the first consideration is actually around the rate of gain. At the time, I am going to paraphrase, but largely I am pretty confident that this is accurate because I listened quite carefully to the episode. But what you said at the time was that your aim, as a rule of thumb, was for people to gain around 1 to 2% of their body weight over the course of a month. And as a result of that, you found that with your clients, you tended to assign a 300 calorie surplus. But this is not to say that that's what you assign every single person. It's just what you noticed when you were trying to help people get to within a rate of gain of 1 to 2% of their body weight per month. They tended to land within a 300 calorie surplus in most cases. And you would then normally check that this was occurring over a fortnight as opposed to looking at weight averages every single week as one might do in a fat loss phase just because muscle growth is much slower. So based on this, how has your mind changed, if it has changed at all?
I'm glad you re-listened to that episode because I know when you invited me on, you were like, "I think your thoughts have changed around like bulking and all of that." And I was like, "Oh, I should listen to that episode." And time occurred, and not listening to the episode happened. So I'm glad you listened to it. And fundamentally, when I hear those comments, it's nothing I strongly disagree with at all. All I would say is my thoughts have become a little bit more nuanced. In that, I think that range is really solid, and I think for a lot of people that will suit them so well, thinking 1 to 2% body weight gain per month. But what I used to be concerned about was wasting time at maintenance. And I think I've had a real perspective shift on that, in that if you have 1 to a month at maintenance, in the past it would have been like, hey, maintenance is not a good place to be as a bodybuilder. You either want to be in a surplus, a deficit. Anytime at maintenance, you're maintaining. It says it on the tin. But actually, you might not be. You might be laying the groundwork for muscle growth, or as we've said, you can recomp, you can actually grow muscle whilst you're at maintenance. And I always, and I hope I said it in that episode, that before nutrition, training is the match that lights the fire for muscle gain. I will like die on that hill that that is the most important thing for muscle growth. You need to be training hard enough and progressing things over time to be able to give that ignition for then what nutrition is just permissive. And then it's a case of, and I'm not sure I said this last time, this is definitely something I am feeling much more strong on, is I guess giving someone a rate of gain that's kind of appropriate given their growth potential. And then lots of things impact your growth potential, not just how much of a novice you are, but also like how good of quality of a stimulus are you driving through your training? Like how good is that match? Like, is it a fresh match and then you're striking it with real good precision, or is it like me? I've been training for like almost 2 decades. It's a really dull match, and I have to strike it with the best like line to even get it to spark a little bit. And then it's like, well, then you can start fueling that. So if you're doing a great job as someone new to the gym and you're sleeping really well, you really push yourself and you have great form and technique, you've got your nutrition in check, hey, you could actually probably, you have a large growth potential on paper, and in practice, you're really doing a good job. But then you could have someone who is maybe 5 years deep, their growth potential is a bit lower on paper, but they have everything. Sorry, actually, let's flip the script. You have a novice in the gym who has a high growth potential on paper, but they're drinking on the weekends, they're barely having like any protein, and like suddenly then in practice, it's not really a good kind of growth situation to have. So I think recognizing those two things then allows you to give a more individualized rate of gain. So I still like the 1 to 2%. I would say 2% is reserved more for that person with a really high growth potential in theory and practice, and then scaling it down towards 1 and even below 1 for someone who is much more advanced, say a decade plus in the gym, even if they're doing a good job. I don't really want them gaining much more than a percentage, because what the data unfortunately has shown us that most obviously is larger surpluses lead to more fat gain. That's been the biggest kind of take home from the literature as at large. And I agree, gaining more body fat isn't worth it. The trade off becomes worse. Even if you got a small amount more muscle gain, that is undone by the exponential fat gain that comes with it. So you kind of want to be scaling that surplus appropriate to your muscle growth potential, which then I've become very comfortable as an advanced lifter myself and with my kind of advanced lifters and those with lower growth potentials to just hover near a maintenance and make adjustments far less frequently. And so I'm just trying to be, for myself as an example, I want to see my body weight creep up over time, but I'm very happy leaving it a month to confirm that before I bump calories up. And then it'll only be like a 50 to 100 calorie bump. And I think that's a fine approach for someone who is like my body is not happy to gain muscle mass, and so I don't want to kind of give it a situation where it's just going to put on loads of body fat. And yeah, because and the final thing I will say is I do think it's a little bit concerning when people try and provide the surplus that is in line with the theoretical amount of muscle mass they could gain. So in theory, maybe I can gain a pound of muscle in a year, let's say 1 to 2 pounds. I hate that idea, but maybe that's where I'm at. I think that's actually fairly practical. But I don't think I should try and only gain whatever that would be divided by the weeks of the year and gain that amount, because that's just going to be like I'm going to be in no man's land. So I think you have to gain a little bit above that and accept fat is the cost of doing business, but you only want to gain as much fat as necessary to maximize the muscle that you're able to gain, because any more than that is just completely wasted time. So I would say, yeah, most of my thoughts have changed surrounding individualizing based off someone's growth rate potential, muscle growth potential, and then if anything, siding on being a bit slower versus more assertive, because that is not time wasted, and you could undo your slight progress by gaining exponential amounts of fat, have to cut sooner. I much prefer someone to just stay in a growth, kind of out of a deficit, as it were, for longer versus gain faster for shorter time periods. Hopefully that answered the question.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you've changed your mind around the idea that maintenance is a waste of time. You no longer feel that way. And you've evolved your thoughts on the topic of how do we scale the surplus and how you scale it to growth potential. So to tie the two ideas together and also to circle back to the idea that bulking is that we've previously discussed, I'm wondering, how do you decide for a client whether for them it's a good idea to go into a bulking phase with a surplus, or whether you want to help them build muscle but staying around maintenance calories and focusing on recomping, given that it is, as you said, it is possible to gain muscle at maintenance calories? What would be the considerations for one versus the other approach?
Great question. Yeah, I have two main thoughts regarding that. One is their goal, and then the other is health, because there are individuals. I think of one client specifically where he was just like, Steve, I don't care how soft I get so long as it's not unhealthy. So like he doesn't have the goal of having a six pack. He doesn't care about being in the teens of body fat particularly. He could be as whatever. He just wants to gain as much muscle as possible and doesn't care about being lean. So it's a case of, right, for you, we could be at high teens of body fat and go through a mass phase, but then it's a case of our cutoff point isn't preference based because you're fine with getting as soft as whatever. It's about not pushing into a zone that's unhealthy. So I think for a lot of guys, that's around 20% body fat. When we start getting much above that, I think it's probably not the best for health. Women can maybe add around 7%. I say around 7%, that's very exact. For some reason, 7% is often what I see referenced as the differential between males and females in terms of body fat. So anyway, you can get about 7% kind of softer than that, as it were. And, body fat percentage is always an interesting one, right? Like no one actually knows unless you kill someone, chop them up, and weigh everything out. That's the only way you can actually get a true body fat. Otherwise, you're all just tools that can be miles off. So I generally prefer a visual assessment, and that can be off too. But ultimately, that's normally what someone's goal is a visual goal of how lean they want to be. And then from a health perspective, I think you can just kind of see when someone's maybe getting there. And also typically there's some biofeedback that tells you someone is getting to a level of body fat and body weight that their body is just not happy being at. You always get blood work to confirm these things. But for males, 20% typically looks like you have no definition, no muscle separation. You look quote unquote kind of soft all over, and again, similar for females. And then as you get towards like mid-teens for males and like higher teens for females, that's when you start seeing, hey, we have maybe a little bit of muscle separation. We can see some ab detail. You can certainly see like capping of delts, like quads rounding, this sort of thing. Waist is a bit tighter. And then as you get lower from that, obviously you just start seeing more and more muscle separation. You start to see striations as you're getting into those like 10% of body fat, or kind of mid-teens for females there. And so I think that's a fine reference tool. So first of all, it's their goal, and then like for him it was health. But for a lot of people, they want to be in that kind of, and in terms of biofeedback of when maybe you're pushing a bit too far, I'd say your sleep quality maybe isn't as good despite doing your best efforts for that. Moving around might feel a little less comfortable. You might find yourself potentially getting a bit out of breath in places where you normally would completely fine and cardiovascularly fit. You might not be digesting food the best, and your hunger and appetite is probably in the tank, and you're not really feeling like eating. And it potentially could even lead to you being able to recover from less volume in the gym. So it's just not a great place to be for muscle growth. And it's largely like you're not going to be very insulin sensitive versus leaner situations and things like this. Again, puts you in a poorer position. So that's some of the biofeedback people can use there in terms of health, at least. But yeah, in terms of someone's goal, it makes me think of a client I have who came to me like very overweight, and we've lost a lot of weight, and but so we'd had to break it up. So we're losing like a 10% chunk, then we take a pause, and then we lose another 10%, and we're kind of going through this process. But every time we take that 10% of body weight off, he's still not really in a position for his goals where it makes sense to gain much weight. So we kind of go through a very slow like maintenance, where it's like, hey, we're at maintenance, but if you gain a little bit of weight, hey, that's just going to reduce diet fatigue even quicker, and we can get back to our goal of getting a bit leaner sooner, because his ultimate goal is to step on stage. But being 20% plus in body fat, he was very far from that goal. So it didn't make sense to put him through a surplus. But then for a lot of people, they want to hang out around that 15% body fat, kind of your beach lean, muscle separation look. And then it's a case of, for a lot of people, like to take them down close to what might be thought as their lower intervention point of body fat. Essentially this low body fat where your body is still happy being here, but any lower than that, your diet fatigue would start just exponentially rising. You'd have to really reduce your food to continue to see weight loss. And it's no man's land for someone who isn't competing or doing a photo shoot or has any particular reason to get very lean. So when you get to that point of which like the diet's starting to pinch quite a lot and you're in those low teens of body fat, getting close to 10% for a lot of people, or like mid-teens for females, of course, then that's when I'm like, hey, you have now bought yourself tons of time to mass. Let's kind of move up from here. But it all depends on the context of where someone's coming from, what their goals are. I think so long as you're between like that quite shredded look, but not stage condition by any means, you have some good muscle separation all the way up to you've lost most of that definition. As long as you're in that range, there's no wrong answers in terms of going through a surplus in that zone. You just might, and actually, I'm glad you brought this up, something that contributes to muscle growth potential that I don't think many people think about is someone who's very, very lean doesn't have body fat stores or a surplus of energy available like someone who's much softer. So they have a smaller, sorry, what am I trying to say? So it's actually interesting because their growth potential is lower, but you want to give them the extra fuel to help support that muscle growth. So if you have an intermediate who's 10% versus an intermediate who's like 16, 17, 18%, that person who's at a higher body fat actually has more fuel on their body that they can utilize. So you don't need as big a surplus, or even you could hang out at maintenance and recomp a little bit versus the person all the way down really, really lean. It's sometimes something, this is a complete tangent, but I think you'll like this, Nikias, so I'm just going to say it. Something I want to ask Eric Helms is people who compete post-show, you'll see some competitors where they go through like a recovery phase, but they put on 15% of their body weight in a couple of months, which is a pretty harsh rebound. But then they just hover there for like their entire off season. They won't go through a surplus, deficit. They'll just stay there until they decide to compete again. Whereas you have someone like myself and many others who are quite careful about kind of gaining at a slower rate so that they have a wide kind of growth potential window where they can be in a surplus for extended periods of time. I'm like, what actually leads to more muscle growth? In my head, the person who stays leaner and can be in a surplus should grow better. But is that true? Could the person who's just got that body fat on them, like, is the body more happy to utilize its own like body fat, or is it happier to use a surplus of energy through the diet? I don't know. I don't think we have an answer to that. But I certainly think both can work because I've seen it with people. So yeah, anyway, I think that's one thing I've just changed my mind in general with a lot of what I do as a coach is the longer I've been doing this, the more I've seen, the more open I am to things that aren't quote unquote optimal on paper. But actually there's real world, like people doing this stuff that when there isn't enough scientific evidence, if there's a huge body of anecdotal evidence, well, suddenly you have to start listening to that quite a lot. And that actually brings me full circle to like bulking is dead. Like it just doesn't pass the first real world test of what bodybuilders, who are the most muscular individuals on the planet, have ever done. They've gone through bulking periods. I think they would have stopped doing that if it wasn't leading to what they wanted.
Agreed on that part. And to circle back to my original question, what considerations would you make for recomping at maintenance versus being in a surplus? Something that I sometimes find with my clients and therefore do with them, which I don't think you've brought up, is that sometimes people don't want to go through cycles of bulking and cutting, because if you commit to a bulk when you are where the goal is to push beyond a body fat level that you want to live with, even just by a few kilograms, I'm not talking about becoming overweight or developing obesity, then you need to also commit to a following cut. Or said in simpler words, if you're not happy with the physique you're going to have at the end of the bulk, you're going to have to accept that you're going to have to go into a fat loss phase afterwards. So in that situation, and these are people that are already at a healthy body fat level, so they don't necessarily need to cut in order to be healthy. So in that situation, I make these people aware that the growth that we're going to see is going to be slower if we remain at maintenance calories and we don't try to increase body weight. It's still going to occur, but also once you remove the surplus, in order to speed up growth, you need to be doing a lot of things right. So at maintenance calories and train hard and regularly, you are going to build muscle. Can you add a +1 to that? Yes, if you also do really well with stress management, with your sleep, you don't just eat your calories, you also eat the micronutrients that you need. Your macro split is where it needs to be. Your meal timing is appropriate. So if you have all of your ducks in a row, that's how you add your +1 to maintenance calories and regular training. And once I present a situation to them in that light, I I let them choose. I tell them, look, if you're really not keen on cutting and bulking cycles, we can try to recomp at maintenance. And I tend to try to give them some expectations around their muscle growth potential, such as you have a lot of muscle growth potential in a recomp phase for these reasons, such as you're very new to the gym, and you are doing a lot of things right, and your body weight is healthy, your body fat level is healthy. Or vice versa, you've been training for 10 plus years, we can recomp, but it is going to be hard. Research shows it's possible, but it is going to be very challenging. And then I let them choose. And if they still want to go through body recomp, then I always tell them, look, we have time. You're not going to die in 3 months. Fingers crossed. I don't know why I always make weird jokes, but here's one. Anyway, so if you are unhappy with the results, if you get impatient with the pace of results, then we can contemplate cutting and bulking again. This is how I go about it when I find that people are not particularly keen on the idea of cutting and bulking, which is one of the reasons why I don't completely disagree with the people who say bulking is dead, because they are offering an alternative to people who are not interested in bodybuilding style cutting and bulking cycles. But as we said before, they're not offering an alternative. They're saying, just do this. This is the way. And the lack of nuance is the issue there. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that aligns completely with my approach as well. Uh, I always come from like my own, we all do, like we have our own biased perspective. And I've certainly held this belief a little bit more strongly where I'm like, hey, if you're working incredibly hard, it's like get all your ducks in a row, training really hard in the gym, just putting yourself in a small surplus will just, you're just going to get that much more muscle growth. And fat loss is so much easier. I always refer to it like cycling downhill versus cycling uphill. Like giving yourself a bit of a surplus is like taking the handbrake off uphill, not doing it, you're putting the brakes on a little bit. And then fat loss is like, hey, you just let it happen. But for some people, like you said, they don't like that. And they've had poor experiences surrounding maybe dieting. And I certainly have those people too. And I think you said the right thing there where, unfortunately, I think where a lot of people go wrong with massing is they go too fast And because they're used to dieting, so they're used to seeing scale weight changes on a week to week basis. And so then they apply that same idea to massing, where they're like, I need to be seeing the scale go up on a week to week basis. And suddenly they've gained like double the weight they were intending to, because they haven't been patient enough to like be like, hey, it should happen at like a fourth the rate maybe of what you're used to. And then for someone who's aiming to recomp, they're like, oh man, what do I focus on if I'm actually just trying to maintain like my body weight? And then you have to really reinforce, and I'm sure you do this, where it's like, right, now we need to focus on, like, we could take a circumference measurement around the waist, maybe now around the navel. We could see if like recomping's happening there. And then we can also focus on the process fundamentally. That's probably what you focus the most on. That's what I find myself focusing the most on. It's like, let's nail the process, because then we'll get the best outcome we possibly could. But then it's gym performance and being like, right, let's make sure you're kind of striking that match and giving your body a reason to do something here. So yeah, and then just outlining, kind of giving people realistic expectations is so important. It just crushes a lot of people, because so many people, their expectations are up here, but actually what's realistic is down here, because they're influenced by what they see on social media. And man, this is again a bit of a tangent, but a day doesn't really go past that I see these crazy transformations from like left to right, and I'm like, I know that person, and I know drugs were involved. So it's like, it looks absurd because they haven't qualified that, and so many people don't realize it. So anyway, that's another talk for another day.
It is an important one, though. I do believe that the lack of realistic expectations is one of the reasons that potentially holds people back the most, because they have these ideas that are inflated often by what they see on social media, and then when their reality is very different for whatever reason, as you say, they are crushed. And worst case scenario, in some cases they even completely give up, because they think, well, clearly I am not meant for this, when in fact they just didn't have the right expectations to begin with. It is one of the responsibilities of a coach, I think, to do their best to provide realistic expectations. At the same time, I say do their best because nobody can really know for sure what your physique is how your physique is going to respond to a surplus or a deficit or training. A coach has helped other people, so they can say, look, based on what I've seen, this is what you can expect. But nobody's ever going to be able to tell you, okay, so your body type is this person's body type that I've worked with, so in the next 6 months this is exactly the kind of change that you can expect. I don't think that that's possible. At least I would never feel confident saying that to a client.
Yeah, exactly that. I've had clients literally position to me like, how many pounds of muscle am I going to gain if I work with you for a year? And I'm just like, man, how long's a piece of string? Like, I literally could not tell you. Like you said, I could give broad strokes of, okay, you've been training this amount of time. If you're to really be on top of your stuff, which you haven't been over the last like year, then I could expect like X amount, and that would be tremendous. It's like, but like I can't guarantee it by any means. We're kind of working with you, and actually the most amount of work has to come from the person on the other end, which sometimes I feel very unfortunate about, because I'm like, I wish I could do this for you, but I can't.
I know, right? But then I've noticed that the more knowledgeable as a coach someone becomes, the less certainty they give when they talk about the potential for results. I do this myself. I've noticed this in myself, whereby people who are just coming into the industry tend to think in very specific terms. How many pounds of muscle can I gain in 6 months or working with you for a year? They have these very specific numbers in mind, whereas the more experienced people more like tend to take the approach, or at least maybe I'm biased because that's the way I think. So I'm just going to say the way I think is your body is a scientific experiment. Whatever you put your body through is an experiment. Your theory is, if I go into a surplus for 6 months and gain gradually, I will put on some muscle. Let's put this theory to the test. Let's see what happens. We can't really say you're going to put on 5 pounds or 10 pounds. We can't say that it's going to be the most successful bulk you'll ever have or the least successful. What we can say is that based on the needs analysis we've done, this seems like a good idea for you. There's a best chance of success that we can have. At any rate, you'll learn something about yourself, which means that your next bulk will be better, or that you choose never to bulk again, whichever it may be. And in any case, you will enrich your own understanding of how your body works. And I believe that that's the best that you can expect, really. You can sometimes have a slightly more specific idea, such as somebody comes to me brand new, they're doing absolutely nothing with training, their nutrition is a mess. Well, I fix all of that, all of a sudden their growth potential is enormous. So in that case, I can say, hey, I can get them a bit excited and say, look, if you do a really good job, we're going to do well here. Like, we're going to see significant change. So there are situations where you can be a bit more specific. But I think that the more you understand about how the body works, the more you understand how it's very hard to be specific. And in many cases, it's not really, it's, I wouldn't feel confident being specific because I don't think I would be, I believe I would be misrepresenting something to the person I'm talking to.
Yeah, unfortunately, some coaches use that as a sales tactic where they sound very confident and they make large promises to individuals, which the coaches who have been in this longer, who are a bit more honest, never do. And yeah, we talk much less in the black and whites and more in the shades of gray, because again, I say this to people when I have a consultation with them. I'm like, because they ask me sometimes what to expect and how will the program look and everything. I'm like, based off our chat, based off all the information you provide me within the consultation form or the kind of next form that you fill out, I'm going to put together the best program I possibly can. But I tell you, it won't be the best program because I'm going to learn so much over the weeks and months that we work together where I get an understanding of actually, you said you were doing this, but in practice, you weren't. You probably had it, Nikias, where someone says, I don't know, they've been eating X amount, and then you put them on food similar to that, and they actually start hitting that. It's like, okay, now this is not, this math is not mathing. Things are not moving in the direction I expected it to. And every client is an individual and their own experiment. And so you have to individualize it. And I think that's what where a lot of people go wrong is like they're novice, they get really easy results, they get to intermediate, results really slow down, and then they follow all the general advice out there, or they think they're following it, at least. They do their best to follow it, and they don't really see the results they want. It's like, well, that's because you are your own individual. So now you need to take a bit more of an individualized approach, and that will help you. And then the results are going to be a bit slower. So you also need to understand that. But I think that's that kind of perma intermediate situation that people can get into where they just lack that sense of direction and they flip flop all the time, hoping that results are going to come quickly when they just find the magic fix. It's like, it's probably not that one thing, it's probably multiple things, and then just giving it time. So yeah, I sometimes wish I could have like a year minimum of coaching with people because I'm like, a year, man, I could see some actual proper results. But we have a 3-month minimum, and 3 months, like, some can be done in that time. Like, you can get people making better habits in a situation like you described. You can really level someone up. For a lot of people, they need more time than that to really kind of get that. For a lot of people, it's a mindset shift, and they have to get comfortable with that.
I agree. I agree completely. I also ask my clients to commit for at least 3 months, but then obviously, if they cannot continue, typically for financial reasons, I'm not going to lock them into a longer contract, of course, but I do tell them, look, my best clients stay around at least 6 to 12 months because that's how, that when we have enough time for me to get to know your body, for you to understand and get good at what you need to do, and therefore to see significant change. But of course, everybody's circumstances are different. However, in an ideal world where everybody has all the money that they want and they can spend all the money they want on coaching, I would want clients to stay on for a year as well. Anyway, bringing the conversation back to bulking, we talked about the rate of gain, and we had a couple of episodes, Steve, where I asked you about anything that you change your mind about regarding nutrition and training. If you remember, this was episode 100, no, it was episode 99 and then 101, I believe, if people want to check those out. And so in those episodes, in the training related one, we talked a lot about training principles where I believe you would not change them for between a bulk and a cut, if anything, because in a bulk, training is more important. So what I want to do now with the time we have left is focus a little bit more on nutrition instead, to see if there's anything around that where you've changed your mind. And I'm going to start with the macronutrients, because we've already talked about calories in that they are related to your rate of gain. As it pertains to protein, at the time we recorded the bulking podcast, you said that you thought that 1 gram per pound of protein, 1 gram of protein per pound of body mass was an appropriate target for most people. However, in a bulking phase, you find that when you put people in a surplus, at least at the time, you said that you prioritize a higher carbohydrate intake as well to fuel training and recovery and potentially to bias insulin sensitivity or to take advantage of insulin sensitivity, though you mentioned that that was a much smaller concern. In any case, given that you prioritized high carb bulking, you also tended to increase protein by 10 grams per per so every 100 grams of carbs that somebody was eating above around 200 grams, you were also bumping up protein by 10 grams on top of the 1 gram per pound rule to account for the fact that carbohydrates do contain protein, but it is of a lower quality. I'm wondering if you still agree with the 1 gram per pound guideline that you gave at the time, and whether you're still bumping up protein to account for a higher carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, great questions. So I guess yes and no. I think 1 gram per pound is still a great kind of just general broad strokes recommendation for people. Again, I will have clients that they struggle to adhere to that because they're just maybe not big on protein, or they don't have much expenditure, so that ends up being a large amount of their total calories, and they're just like, do I have to eat that much protein? And I'm not convinced to, certainly to see muscle growth, they don't need to eat that much. To maximize it, that's a different ball game. And a lot of my clients come to me to maximize things, so I kind of take that perspective generally. But I'll be happy to set them a minimum of like 0.7 per pound, 0.7 grams of protein per pound in those sort of circumstances. But then, in regards to kind of that, I remember doing that kind of in my head. That was a clever calculation of for an average 100 grams of carbohydrates, you tend to get 20 grams of tag along protein. Let's count half of that as being useful. So let's add another 10 grams on top to just make sure we've got enough. And I still think old me had the right idea there. And I still prefer to take like a maximizer approach versus a minimizer. Like you'll get people being like, again, they'll be like, hey, just do enough to grow, minimum effective volume, or let's just have enough protein to what we think will pretty much maximize the results, because past there's diminishing returns. And that's a great, efficient, very smart mindset to have. And I do that with other things in my life where I'll put the minimum effort in to get the job done. But I'm a bodybuilder, competitive, lots of my clients are, and they want to maximize their results. So I'm like, hey, protein is the most important macro to get in place for muscle growth. So I don't want to risk being even a little bit below what might be maximizing it. I want to really, really make sure. So I thought that was a smart approach. But on digging into it a bit deeper, a lot of the recommendations for protein take into consideration the entire protein of the diet. They aren't just looking at the most bioavailable protein. So I don't think it's as big a concern as what I had previously. So I don't tend to worry about doing that calculation. I just tend to now bump up protein recommendations because we have had new research from, I think it was Refalo, Martin Refalo's lab. They kind of looked at protein intakes more so when dieting and what kind of maximize muscle protein synthesis. And that data looks very similar to a lot of the volume data where it's like more is better. And we don't have a cutoff point, but it does diminish vastly past a certain point. So that just encouraged my maximizer brain and protein loving brain to be like, hey, we could go up to 1.2, 1.3 grams per pound. And there could still be an extra benefit there. So I tend to have 1 gram per pound still as my like, hey, that's a great middle ground of it's plenty above 0.7. So we're much above the minimum. It's still not as high as 1.2, 1.3, which is high protein intake for a lot of people. And again, if they're not on that many calories, it might be just a bit too much. So I think that 1 gram per pound still works really well for people. But for myself, I push up to that kind of 1.2 grams per pound. And a lot of my kind of bodybuilders love their protein, and we push up to that amount because, hey, there's diminishing returns, but what's eating more protein? Hey, I just get to eat more protein. That's great. I don't mind if it's a little bit less than other things. So that's been quite nice. And that was further emphasized from working with Cliff Wilson. For those that don't know, he's probably the most notorious natural bodybuilding coach there is out there. And he's always had this high protein approach. So he had me on higher protein than I had myself on initially. And then I've just kind of continued that, being like, hey, with this new research coming out too, it seems pretty promising that to maximize, we can, like, having high protein is not a problem. Especially the key thing to understand there is, like, more protein isn't better. Well, actually, more protein is better until it takes away from the other macronutrients to not give you enough of those to be maximizing results, or you can't adhere to the diet. Like, they're the two, like, flaws. So I think that's important to consider. And then I still prioritize carbohydrates, but I'm less picky about it. I used to try and keep fat, like, as low as, not physically possible, but like, hey, enough to meet your essential fatty acids and enough for like hormone production. But everything above that is just extra calories that could go to carbs, which are more insulinogenic. And so maybe there's a bit of a muscle growth benefit there. But I'm just, the longer you do this, Nikias, you probably agree, I expect, the more you realize those little things that sound really cool and sexy and like, oh, maybe this is the silver bullet that's going to get me a bit of results, they come out in quite a wash. So I still encourage a higher carbohydrate intake versus fats, because I agree, fueling performance, recovery, all that. And also plants, health, micronutrients, phytonutrients from fruit and veg. I get like 10 fruit and veg in my diet a day, and it's super easy when your carbs are nice and high. So I like to do that. But yeah, I'm less strict on that ruling. High protein, fat and carbs, enough of both in that correct, like, surplus is about what I care most for, and not being too anal about, like, if my protein can't be that high one day, it's not a stress. Be nice and flexible with that. It's one day where I'm missing out on those potential diminishing returns of MPS.
That makes sense. You could argue that the lower stress that you get is anabolic in and of itself anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stress, that's where the kind of practice, like the scientific textbook answers don't always meet practice. You have to, again, that's why for some people it's just not worth pushing their protein up higher, even if there's a small theoretical benefit. They wouldn't see it because it's just going to cause them excess stress.
Exactly. So then moving on from the macros, I would talk about nutrient timing. So at the time, you mentioned that you would suggest 3 to 6 protein servings per day, and you found that 4 to 5 protein servings in a day were the sweet spot to maximize muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. Well, you didn't find it, you couldn't look at muscle protein synthesis, but you thought that that would be the sweet spot in your view, knowing what you knew about the literature back then. And this was for protein timing. For carbs timing, you tended to bias carbohydrates around the workout window. So before training, after training, and sometimes with an intra workout. But you weren't obsessive about it, you said that at the time. And you thought that it was possibly more helpful the more advanced somebody was, because they needed to have more ducks in a row to try to bias that surplus towards muscle growth. I'm wondering how your thoughts have changed, if they have, on both protein and carb timing.
Nicely, they have changed, slightly evolved. I've been nudged in a certain direction because we have had more evidence come out, mostly on the protein timing side and relating to muscle protein synthesis. I had John Tromblin, I pronounce his name wrong, but that's how I say it, on my podcast a while ago, because he looked into a 100-gram bolus of protein. And a lot of people thought there was this like muscle fill effect. Once you get much above, I think it's like 40, 50 grams of protein, you basically cap your muscle protein synthesis. And any more than that is kind of quote unquote wasted. Obviously, you still use it for energy and everything, but it's not giving you a higher muscle protein synthesis effect. Then you need to wait 3-4 hours for that muscle protein ceiling to come down, and then you give it another pulse. And so the net effect across the day from having 4 to 6 feedings, you get a higher net total muscle protein synthesis. However, John was like, hey, snakes seem to eat like a whole rabbit in one go and they survive really well. What happens when we go above this like 40-50 grams? And he went up to 100 grams and found, hey, you just get more muscle protein synthesis the more protein you have in a single feeding. So that then was really helpful, because it kind of squared a few circles where people are a bit unsure about, hey, some of this literature is suggesting that frequency and that kind of muscle MPS like pulsing effect and having more servings through the day is important. And then other research like this intermittent fasting research where people are just getting like pretty much as good results from having 1 to 2 servings. So I think it was useful seeing that because it was again like, hey, you can have a lot of protein in one sitting, up to 100 grams. We have researched and show that you get like just more MPS. So it's not a big stressor to have to split that 100 grams to 2 or 3 servings to kind of fit in your day. And then we have a little bit of research comparing 2 to 3 protein servings through the day, and the 3 does beat out the 2. And so I do think I mean, we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner for so long, and that seems to just to work really, really well. And I think it makes sense to try and spread that through your day. So kind of on waking, sometime in the morning, have a protein serving. In the middle of the day, have a protein serving. In the evening, have a protein serving. 3, I think you've pretty much maximized your results that way. Going more than that, I don't think you're going to get anything more, but it's not going to harm. Going less than that, you might lose out on a little bit. But again, we have intermittent fasting studies where people have like 1 meal a day and they still can grow. But the more advanced you are, the less growth potential you have, the more ducks you need to have in a row, like you said. So that's where I stand is like, hey, 3 to 4, I think is so practical and suitable for so many people that that's where I stand. But again, there might be people that want to have less and the intermittent fast, whatever. I'm okay with that. There might be people who want to have more, but I tend to find that to be a bit impractical. But I don't give meal plans to my clients. I just give recommendations. And if they want to do that, hey, have at it. They might like the nibbling food every now and then. There's also pulled into question the whole leucine threshold situation where it was like, hey, you need to have at least 20 grams of protein of a high quality protein to meet the leucine threshold to get that muscle protein synthesis spike. But again, some researchers pulled that into question as well. So protein in general, it's like, it comes back to that kind of, what was the main principle? Meet your protein recommendation by the end of the day. And if you do that through basically any means, you're pretty much getting every best result you could. If you can split it between at least 3 servings, then you've essentially done your job as someone trying to maximize things. So that's kind of where I stand with the protein. Carbohydrates are pretty similar. I'm not aware of any new research that's come out. I think if it has, it's probably been on like the chrononutrition side, which I think probably still lines up with where it has before. I haven't looked into it, to be fair. So I still do try and favor people to place carbohydrates around their workout. I think that just makes sense. But most importantly, not going to workouts hungry seems to be the thing that at least the research has elucidated. You don't want to be hungry during your workout. I think it makes sense that if you have a high volume session, you're training 2 hours, say, have a easy to digest and kind of keep your blood sugar high within the workout sort of situation with an intra workout. For someone who's advanced on good food, it just makes sense. There's a bit of security in that situation. But as I probably said last time, it's not going to make or break progress. And in fact, as we talked about, you can be your own experiment. So you could try an intra workout, see if it helps. Some people, I've had clients where are like, man, I just stayed switched on and I got better performance. And that intra workout definitely helped. Others have been like, no, it's nothing. I'm like, okay, so long as you have a good pre-workout meal, you're getting some food sometime after, the kind of post-workout window isn't such a thing. It's the barn door, right? That still holds. Not a huge deal. And then with the chrononutrition, I do still think, where possible, try not to have too much food before bed. It just, in my experience, does harm sleep. And even in people that think it doesn't harm their sleep, I think it's a situation like people have alcohol and they're like, oh yeah, acts as like a sedative and I fall asleep, but their quality is worse. And so I think the quality of sleep is just not as good if you have a large amount of food pre-bed. And I'm saying that as someone who within my last 2.5 hours, I get maybe close to 1,000 calories in quite often. I'm nearly on 4,000 calories, mind you. And I still don't quite adhere because I enjoy sitting down in the evening and having a good meal. So I struggle, but I just make sure that I'm not having loads of food right before bed. Like if I've had situations where I've been out for a lot of the day, come home and I'm like, I have 1,000 calories to eat. It's 9 p.m. I go to bed at 10. I'm just like, hey, I'll eat 500. That extra 500, that's going to another day or days because it's not worth stuffing myself now to have like potentially gastric reflux or worse sleep in bed. So I think that probably sums most of my new perspectives surrounding nutrient timing and protein timing and carbohydrate timing.
Absolutely, thank you. And since you brought up Dr. Tromeland's research, you reminded me of something that I meant to do earlier, where you brought up Eric Elms's paper on being in a surplus versus at maintenance. I actually interviewed him on this. So, dear listeners, if you want to check this out, that was episode 61. And I also interviewed Astrid Naranjo on this, who is a dietitian. She was writing for BioLane's Lane Norton's research review RAPS, and she wrote a review article of Dr. Tromlin's research paper where he experimented with feeding people 100 grams of protein in one go, just what you referenced, Steve. So, dear listeners and watchers on YouTube, if you want to listen to that episode, you can check it out at, and it was episode 82. So I meant to bring up, plugs for my podcast earlier, and then I completely forgot while we were talking. Anyway, Steve, I think we've had a pretty comprehensive conversation about your thoughts and how they have evolved with respect to bulking around the rate of gain, the potential that someone has to gain, maintenance versus going into a surplus, and then some aspects of nutrition as well. And as I said, if people want to hear more about the evolution of your thoughts regarding training, this isn't a podcast that we recorded yesterday or anything, but it's still relatively recent compared to the podcast on bulking, which was from 2022. This was one that we must have recorded. I can't remember exactly, but might have been like 2025 or late 2024. And that was episode 98, over a decade of wisdom on training for physique goals. And I might have you back on anyway in a few months to talk about the evolution since then of your thoughts on training. But largely, I believe that people are gonna get a good understanding of what your somewhat recent stance is from that episode. And now, Steve, I really want to be respectful of your time, so I am going to bring the podcast to a close. But as always, let people know where they can find you and how they can get in touch to work with you if they want some coaching.
Thank you, Nikias. Yeah, it's always great being on here and to chat. And as you found out, I'm easy to get on. No, I'm joking. You can bring me on anytime. I'm always down for it. And I hope people got value from this. So, yeah, if people want to check out the Revive Stronger podcast, if they like podcasts, they'll love the Revive Stronger podcast. And then revivestronger.com has our coaching and services over there. If you enjoyed this and you're like, hey, you sound like the coach for me, we'd love to coach you. We have a great coaching team, myself included, and so we can definitely get that going. And I'm most present, Revive Stronger, over on Instagram. That's where you'll catch me most of the time. I'm trying to elevate my YouTube game this year with some more vlogs, so stay tuned.
Well, and when I put the link to your podcast in the show notes, people will be able to access your YouTube channel through that as well if they want. So, Steve, thanks again for coming on. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in, and I will talk to you next time.